The plane shook so hard that Elena Voss bit through her lip without realizing it. Metal groaned above her head. Somewhere behind her, a woman screamed a name that would never be answered. The oxygen mask swung uselessly from the ceiling, and the world outside the window was nothing but gray cloud and falling rain. Elena gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned white. She had boarded this small private charter only 3 hours earlier, dressed sharply for a business meeting that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. She had a folder of contracts in her bag, a coffee going cold in the cup holder, and a headache from reading too many numbers on her laptop screen. None of that mattered anymore. The plane dropped suddenly, like the floor of the world had disappeared. Elena's stomach lurched into her throat. She looked across the narrow aisle and caught the eyes of the only other passenger seated near her, a man with dark hair and a jaw set so tight it looked carved from stone. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't gripping anything in fear. He was simply watching the chaos with the calm of someone who had seen worse. She didn't know his name. She had noticed him boarding, noticed the quiet way he moved, the way the flight staff had treated him with an odd, careful respect. But there had been no time for introductions. There was no time now either. The pilot's voice cracked over the intercom, warning them to brace. Elena bent forward, arms over her head, heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else. The plane lurched to the side. Trees flashed past the window, close enough to touch. Then came the impact. It was not one crash but many, a series of violent jolts as the plane tore through the treetops, metal shrieking, bags and debris flying through the cabin. Elena felt her body thrown against the seatbelt, the world spinning, sound turning into a dull roar that filled every part of her. Then, darkness. When she opened her eyes again, everything was still. Smoke curled lazily near the front of the plane, though there was no fire, just a haze, mixing with the cold mountain air, pouring through a long tear in the fuselage. Rain fell steadily, tapping on broken metal, running down the shattered windows. Elena's head throbbed. Her shoulder ached from the seatbelt that had likely saved her life. She unbuckled it slowly, wincing, and looked around. The cabin was destroyed. Seats were torn from their bolts. Luggage was scattered everywhere, spilled open, its contents soaked and useless. She could not see or hear any of the other passengers. Panic rose in her chest as she called out, her voice hoarse and shaking, but no one answered. No one except a single, low groan from somewhere near the front. Elena crawled over broken seats, cutting her palm on a jagged piece of metal, until she found him. The same man from before, pinned partly beneath a collapsed panel, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. His eyes were open, and when they found hers, there was no panic in them either, only sharp, focused calculation, as if his mind was already working through what came next. "Help me move this," he said, his voice low and steady despite the blood on his face. Elena didn't think. She simply acted, pulling at the twisted metal with him, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Together they freed his leg. He tested it, wincing but standing, and then he did something she did not expect. He reached down and pulled her up too, checking her over with quick, efficient eyes, the way someone checks a piece of equipment rather than a stranger. "Are you hurt anywhere serious?" he asked. "I don't think so," she managed. "My shoulder, my hand. I'm not sure about anything else." He nodded once, filing the information away, and turned to look through the torn opening in the plane's side. Outside was a wall of dense forest, mist hanging low between the trees, mountains rising in the distance under a heavy gray sky. There was no sign of any road, any town, any hint of civilization. "We need to check for other survivors," Elena said, her voice cracking. They searched together, moving carefully through the wreckage. What they found was worse than either of them wanted to say out loud. The front section of the plane, where the pilot and co-pilot had been, was crushed beyond recognition. The other passengers, a small group of business travelers and one flight attendant, had not survived the impact. Elena sank down onto a torn seat, her hands shaking uncontrollably, the shock finally catching up to her. Tears blurred her vision. She had spoken to the flight attendant only hours before, laughing about turbulence, joking that flying was safer than driving. Now that woman was gone, and Elena was alive only because of where she happened to be sitting. The man crouched in front of her, not touching her, but close enough that his presence cut through some of the spiraling fear. "Listen to me," he said. His voice had none of the softness people usually offered in moments like this, but there was something steady in it, something that made her look up. "Falling apart later is allowed. Right now, we need to move. Night is coming, and we are exposed here."
Who are you?
Elena asked, wiping at her face. "Dmitri," he said simply, offering nothing more. She didn't press him. There would be time for questions later, she told herself, though some instinct deep inside her whispered that she might not want to know the answers. Dmitri began pulling supplies from the wreckage with brisk efficiency. A blanket here, a first aid kit there, bottles of water that had somehow survived the crash intact. Elena watched him work, noticing the way he moved without wasted effort, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, even while his hands stayed busy. It wasn't the behavior of an ordinary businessman. "You've done this before," she said quietly. "Survival, I mean." He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Everyone should know how to survive," he said, and then he changed the subject, asking her to help gather anything useful from the remaining bags before the light disappeared completely. They worked in silence for a while, the forest around them growing darker, the temperature dropping fast. Elena's hands trembled as she packed items into a bag, partly from the cold, and partly from the horror of the last few hours settling into her bones. She had left her apartment that morning thinking about a merger deal. Now she was standing in a mountain wilderness beside a stranger, surrounded by the wreckage of a plane and the bodies of people she would never speak to again. "We should move away from the crash site," Dmitri said finally, slinging a bag over his uninjured shoulder. "Rescue teams will look here eventually, but we need shelter before dark. There's a slope to the east that looked more sheltered. Trees are thicker there." Elena nodded, though every part of her wanted to simply sit down and refuse to move. Instead, she followed him, stepping carefully over debris, glancing back once at the crumpled shape of the plane fading into the mist behind them. It looked smaller already, swallowed by the forest, as if the wilderness was already erasing any evidence that they had ever been there. They walked for nearly an hour, Dmitri leading with quiet confidence, checking the ground, the trees, the shifting light through the canopy. Elena's shoulder throbbed with every step, and her shoes, meant for airport terminals and office floors, were already soaked through and blistering her feet. She said nothing, focusing instead on placing one foot in front of the other, matching his pace as best she could. Finally, he stopped beneath a rocky overhang, thick trees pressing close on either side, offering some protection from the wind and rain. It wasn't much, but compared to the open wreckage, it felt like a fortress. "This will do for tonight," he said, already dropping the bags and surveying the space with a critical eye. "We'll build a fire, get you warm, and figure out the rest in the morning." "You keep saying we like you've done this 100 times, Elena said, sitting down heavily on a flat stone, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. Dmitri knelt near a pile of dry branches he had gathered along the way, arranging them with practiced hands. "Let's just say I don't like being unprepared," he said, and something in his tone told her that was the closest to an honest answer she would get tonight. He worked quickly, striking a small fire starter from the emergency kit, coaxing a flame to life despite the damp wood. Elena watched the fire catch, small and flickering at first, then growing steadier, casting warm light across the rocky shelter. For the first time since the crash, she felt a small measure of safety, though it was fragile, easily shattered by the memory of what lay behind them in the wreckage. "Thank you," she said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "For pulling me out, for all of this." Dmitri glanced at her from across the fire, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You would have done the same," he said, though there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely sure that was true, not because he doubted her kindness, but because he knew, better than most, how differently people behaved when survival was on the line. Elena studied him for a long moment, taking in the sharp lines of his face, the calm control in his every movement, the faint scar near his temple that spoke of some past she couldn't begin to guess at. There was something dangerous beneath his calm exterior, something she couldn't name yet, but it sent a quiet warning through her, even as the warmth of the fire eased the chill in her bones. We should try to sleep, Dmitri said eventually, breaking the silence. Tomorrow we start looking for a way out of here, or a way to be found. Elena nodded, lying down on the hard ground with the thin blanket he offered, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest settling into night. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the plane falling, heard the screams, felt the terrifying weightlessness of those final seconds before impact. Across the fire, Dmitri sat with his back against the rock, seemingly unbothered by exhaustion, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Elena wondered, in the hazy space between waking and sleep, what kind of man remained so composed after surviving something so violent, so devastating. She did not know yet that the man watching over her through the night carried secrets far more dangerous than the mountain around them, secrets that would soon change the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. For now, there was only the fire, the cold, and the strange, uneasy comfort of not being entirely alone in the wilderness. As the flames burned low and the forest grew quiet, Elena finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that the man sitting silently beside her was already thinking several steps ahead, already calculating how to keep them both alive, and already deciding, in a way he would not admit even to himself, that he had no intention of losing her to this mountain. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering weakly through the thick canopy above. Elena woke stiff and cold, her body aching in places she hadn't known could hurt. Dmitri was already awake, crouched near the remains of the fire, studying a small compass he had pulled from one of the salvaged bags. "Sleep well?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Not really," Elena admitted, sitting up slowly. "Did you sleep at all?" "Enough," he said, which she suspected meant not at all. They shared a small portion of food from the emergency supplies, mostly in silence, both of them still processing the reality of their situation in their own ways. Elena found herself watching him more closely in the daylight, noticing details she had missed the night before. The way his hands, though currently gentle in handling their meager supplies, looked like they were made for far rougher work. The way his eyes never fully relaxed, always tracking movement at the edge of the trees. "We should try to find higher ground," Dmitri said finally, packing away the remaining supplies. "If there's a search underway, we'll have a better chance of being seen from somewhere open." Elena nodded, pushing herself to her feet despite the protest of her sore muscles. "And if there isn't a search? If no one knows where to look?" Dmitri paused, considering the question with the same calm focus he seemed to apply to everything. "Then we make our own way out," he said simply. "Either way, we're not staying here longer than necessary." There was something reassuring in his certainty, even though Elena knew, deep down, that certainty alone would not be enough to guarantee their survival. Still, she found herself trusting him, if only because she had no other choice, and because something about the steady way he carried himself made the impossible feel slightly less impossible. They set out shortly after, moving carefully through the dense forest, climbing steadily toward a ridge Dmitri believed would offer a better vantage point. The terrain was rough, the ground slick with rain from the night before, and more than once Elena stumbled, only to find his hand steadying her before she could fall. "You're stronger than you think," he said at one point, when she apologized for slowing them down. "I'm a corporate lawyer," she said with a tired laugh. "I spend most of my life sitting behind a desk. I don't think strength has much to do with it." Dmitri glanced at her, something almost like amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "Strength isn't just physical," he said. "You haven't stopped moving since we found each other in that wreckage. That counts for something." Elena didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, simply continuing to climb, grateful for the small measure of encouragement in an otherwise terrifying situation. As the day wore on, the forest grew thinner, the ground steeper, until finally, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Mountains stretched in every direction, dense with forest, with no sign of roads, towns, or any hint of human presence beyond the wreckage they had left behind. Elena's heart sank at the sight, the sheer scale of the wilderness pressing down on her with a weight she hadn't fully appreciated until now. "It's beautiful," Dmitri said quietly, surprising her. "It's terrifying," Elena countered, though she couldn't deny the strange, wild beauty of the landscape stretching endlessly before them. "Both things can be true," he said, and for a moment, standing beside him on that ridge, surrounded by nothing but sky and mountains, and the quiet companionship of survival, Elena almost believed him. They stayed at the ridge only long enough to rest and study the terrain, before continuing on, Dmitri marking their path carefully, always calculating, always thinking several steps ahead. Elena found herself falling into a strange rhythm with him, an unspoken partnership built entirely out of necessity, yet somehow feeling more real than many relationships she had spent years cultivating in her ordinary life. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, they had found a second, more secure shelter for the night. This one nestled beside a small stream that offered fresh water. As Dmitri worked to build another fire, Elena sat nearby, finally allowing herself a moment to simply breathe, to process the strange, frightening, and oddly intimate day they had shared. She still knew almost nothing about the man beside her, only his first name and the quiet, capable way he moved through danger, as though he had been born for it. But as the fire caught and warmth spread through their small shelter once more, Elena found herself wondering, with a mixture of curiosity and unease, exactly who Dmitri really was, and what kind of life had prepared him so thoroughly for a moment like this. She did not yet know that the answer to that question would change everything. By the third day, the rhythm of survival had become almost familiar to Elena, though nothing about it felt normal. She woke before sunrise, her body sore but slightly more used to the hard ground, and found Dmitri already awake, studying a rough map he had sketched onto a torn piece of paper using landmarks from their trek so far. "There's a river valley to the south," he said without looking up. "Rivers usually lead to towns, or at least to roads. It's a longer route, but a safer bet than wandering blind through the mountains." "You've clearly done a lot of hiking," Elena said, only half joking, as she stretched the stiffness from her limbs. Dmitri glanced up at her, something guarded passing behind his eyes before he answered. "Something like that," he said, folding the map and tucking it away. "Eat something. We should move before the weather turns again." Elena ate quietly, watching him from across their dwindling supplies. 2 days of forced closeness had worn away some of her caution, though not all of it. There was still an entire world of things she didn't know about him, questions she hadn't dared to ask, mysteries that lingered every time he handled a knife with too much familiarity, or scanned the tree line with the sharp instincts of someone trained, rather than simply careful. They set off soon after, moving through terrain that grew steadily more difficult, thick underbrush tearing at their clothes, uneven ground threatening to twist an ankle with every careless step. Elena stumbled more than once, and each time, Dmitri was there, a steady hand catching her elbow, keeping her upright without comment, as though it were simply expected of him. "You don't have to keep doing that," she said after the third time, slightly breathless, brushing dirt from her palms. "Doing what?" "Catching me. I can pick myself up." Something flickered across his face, almost like a smile, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I know you can," he said. "That doesn't mean I won't." The words settled strangely in her chest, warmer than she wanted to admit given the circumstances. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the path ahead, on the growing sound of rushing water that promised they were nearing the river Dmitri had spoken of. They reached the riverbank by mid-afternoon, the water wide and fast-moving, cutting a silver path through the dense green of the forest. Elena knelt at the edge, splashing cold water onto her face, grateful for even this small comfort after days of grime and exhaustion. "We follow this downstream," Dmitri said, crouching beside her, his eyes tracing the river's path as far as it was visible. "It should lead us toward lower ground eventually. Rivers don't run uphill." "How do you know so much about surviving out here?" Elena asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "You're not just some businessman who got lucky learning a few survival tricks. This is instinct, not luck." Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he considered his answer. "My work has taken me to difficult places," he said finally, carefully vague. "I learned a long time ago that being prepared isn't optional if you want to keep breathing." "That's not really an answer," Elena pressed. some of her old courtroom instincts rising to the surface despite the strangeness of the moment. "It's the only one you're getting for now," Dmitri said, though there was no real anger in his tone, only a quiet warning that told her not to push further, at least not yet. Elena let the matter drop, though her curiosity only deepened. There was something about the careful way he avoided certain topics, the practiced ease with which he redirected conversations away from his past, that told her whatever he was hiding mattered a great deal. She filed the thought away, along with the growing list of small telling details she had gathered about him over the last few days. They continued along the riverbank as the afternoon stretched on, the terrain slightly easier here, the ground flatter, though still slick with mud in places from the recent rain. Elena found herself talking more as they walked, filling the silence with stories from her life before the crash, her work, her small apartment in the city, the ordinary rhythms of a life that felt impossibly distant now. Dmitri listened more than he spoke, occasionally asking a question, his attention fully on her, in a way that felt oddly intense, as though he were memorizing every detail she offered. It should have unsettled her, that level of focus from a man she barely knew, but instead, it felt strangely comforting, as though someone was finally paying real attention to her for the first time in years. "You really love your work," he observed at one point, after she had spent several minutes describing a case she had recently closed. "I do," Elena admitted. "It's not glamorous, mostly contracts and negotiations, but there's something satisfying about untangling a complicated problem and finding a solution that works for everyone. Not everyone gets that luxury," Dmitri said quietly, something distant in his tone. "Finding a solution that works for everyone. What do you mean?" He shook his head slightly, as though pulling himself back from wherever his thoughts had wandered. "Nothing. Just an observation. Keep going. Tell me more about your work." Elena studied him for a moment, sensing there was more beneath the surface of that comment than he was willing to share, but she let it go, continuing her story, watching the way his expression softened slightly as he listened, the hard edges of his composure easing, just slightly, in her presence. As evening approached, they found a suitable spot to make camp near a bend in the river, sheltered by an outcropping of rock that offered protection from the wind. Dmitri set about building a fire with the same practiced efficiency as before, while Elena gathered what edible plants she could identify from a survival pamphlet she had found in the emergency kit, feeling a small, unexpected sense of accomplishment when she managed to find something useful. "Not bad," Dmitri said, examining her small collection of greens with an approving nod. "You're a fast learner." "High praise from someone who seems to know everything about surviving in the wild," Elena said, allowing herself a small smile, the first genuine one she had managed since the crash. They ate together as the fire crackled and the sky darkened overhead, the conversation flowing more easily now, touching on lighter topics, favorite foods, places they had traveled, small preferences, and opinions that painted a fuller picture of who they each were, beneath the crisis that had brought them together. Elena found herself laughing at one point, a real unguarded laugh, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. "I didn't think laughter was possible out here," she admitted, still smiling. "Neither did I," Dmitri said, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something softer than the guarded calm he usually wore. The moment stretched between them, comfortable and warm despite the cold night air, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a fragile, dangerous kind of trust taking root, despite every instinct telling her to remain cautious around a man whose past remained a locked door. Later that night, as Elena lay wrapped in her blanket near the dying fire, she found herself watching Dmitri across the flames, his sharp features softened in the flickering light, his usual vigilance dimmed slightly by exhaustion. She thought about the strange path that had brought them here together, two strangers thrown into crisis, growing closer through shared hardship in ways she never could have anticipated. "Dmitri," she said quietly into the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything. I don't think I would have made it this far without you." There was a long pause before he answered, his voice quieter than usual when he finally spoke. "You would have found a way," he said. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." Elena closed her eyes, letting his words settle over her, along with the strange warmth that seemed to grow stronger between them with each passing day, despite every reason she had to remain guarded. Sleep came more easily that night, lulled by the sound of the river and the quiet presence of the man across the fire, though she remained unaware of just how much her life was about to change once their ordeal in the wilderness finally came to an end. The following morning brought new challenges. The river had risen slightly overnight from rain further upstream, forcing them to navigate carefully along its edge, the ground slick and treacherous in places. Dmitri led the way with careful precision, testing each step before committing his weight, occasionally reaching back to guide Elena over particularly difficult sections. It was during one of these moments, as he helped her across a slippery outcrop of rock, that Elena noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small, faded mark on the inside of his wrist, mostly hidden beneath his sleeve until it slipped slightly during the movement. It looked deliberate, symbolic in some way she couldn't quite place, though he pulled his sleeve back down before she could study it further. "What was that?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her caution once again. "Nothing important," Dmitri said, his tone closing the subject firmly, though the brief flash of something guarded in his eyes told her otherwise. Elena didn't push, though the small mystery joined the growing collection of unanswered questions surrounding the man who had, in just a few short days, become the most important person in her immediate survival. She trusted him with her life, quite literally, and yet she barely knew anything true about who he really was beyond this shared crisis. They pressed on through the day, the terrain gradually becoming more manageable as they moved further from the crash site, the dense wilderness slowly giving way to gentler slopes and thinner trees. By late afternoon, Dmitri paused at the top of a small rise, studying something in the distance with a focused intensity that immediately caught Elena's attention. "What is it?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He pointed toward a thin line cutting through the trees far below, barely visible, but unmistakably artificial. "A road," he said, something like relief coloring his usually controlled voice. "If we can reach that, we have a real chance of finding help." Elena felt a surge of hope, so powerful, it nearly brought tears to her eyes. The first real possibility of rescue since the crash had stranded them in this wilderness. "How far do you think it is?" "A few hours, maybe less if the terrain cooperates," Dmitri said, already calculating their route with the same careful precision he applied to everything. "We should be able to reach it before nightfall if we move quickly." They set off immediately, energized by the possibility of rescue, moving faster than they had in days despite their exhaustion. Elena felt lighter with every step, the weight of uncertainty easing slightly as the promise of the outside world grew closer with each passing hour. But as they drew nearer to the road, Dmitri's demeanor shifted subtly, his earlier relief replaced by something more guarded, more watchful. Elena noticed the change but said nothing, sensing that whatever concerns had settled over him were not ones he was ready to share, at least not yet. Little did she know, reaching that road would mark not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of an entirely different kind of danger, one that would soon reveal exactly who Dmitri truly was, and force Elena to confront a truth far more dangerous than anything the wilderness had thrown at them so far. The road was narrow and cracked, clearly not well maintained, but to Elena, it looked like the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stumbled onto the gravel shoulder and let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, spinning to look at Dmitri with tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "We made it," she said. "We actually made it." Dmitri allowed himself a small, rare smile, though his eyes continued scanning both directions of the empty road, with the same restless vigilance he had shown throughout their entire journey. "Don't celebrate yet," he said. "We still need to find someone." They didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, the low rumble of an engine echoed through the trees, and a battered pickup truck rounded the bend, driven by a startled farmer named Gareth who nearly swerved off the road at the sight of two exhausted, injured strangers, waving frantically from the shoulder. Gareth wasted no time getting them into his truck, listening with wide eyes as Elena, in halting, exhausted sentences, explained about the crash, the days spent surviving in the wilderness, the desperate need to reach help. He drove them straight to the nearest town, a small collection of buildings nestled at the base of the mountains, promising to alert the authorities the moment they arrived. The next several hours passed in a blur for Elena. There were paramedics checking her over, wrapping her shoulder, cleaning the cut on her hand. There were local police officers asking careful, methodical questions about the crash location, the number of survivors, anything she could remember that might help recovery teams locate the wreckage, and the passengers who hadn't survived. Through it all, Dmitri remained close by, though Elena noticed, even in her exhaustion, that his manner had changed considerably since reaching civilization. He was quieter, more watchful, his eyes tracking every person who approached with an intensity that seemed excessive for their circumstances. When a police officer asked for his full name and identification, something flickered across his face, brief and calculated, before he answered smoothly, giving details that felt, to Elena's trained legal instincts, slightly too rehearsed. "Dmitry Kosarov," he said, and something about the way the officer's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, told Elena that the name meant something the officer hadn't expected. She filed the observation away, too exhausted and overwhelmed to process it fully in the moment, focusing instead on the relief of finally being safe, of finally being warm and fed, and out of the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. That evening, after being cleared by medical staff and given a room at a small local inn, while arrangements were made to get them back to the city, Elena finally found a quiet moment alone with Dmitri in the inn's modest lobby. He stood near the window, looking out at the darkened street, his posture tense in a way she hadn't seen even during their most dangerous moments in the wilderness. "You're different now," Elena said, approaching carefully. "Ever since we got to town, what's going on?" Dmitri didn't turn immediately, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. "It's complicated," he said finally. "I think after everything we've been through, I've earned an explanation," Elena said, some of her old professional firmness returning to her voice despite her exhaustion. He turned to face her then, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something like genuine hesitation in his expression, as though he were weighing exactly how much truth she could handle. "My name is known in certain circles," he said carefully. "Circles you wouldn't normally have contact with. My family has significant business interests, interests that sometimes attract attention from law enforcement, from rivals, from people who would very much like to see those interests fail." "What kind of business interests?" Elena asked, though some deep instinct already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. "The kind that don't officially exist on paper," Dmitri said quietly. "The kind that operate in the spaces between legal and illegal, where the rules are written by those strong enough to enforce them." Elena felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold night air outside. "Are you telling me you're involved in organized crime?" Dmitri held her gaze steadily, offering no denial, no softening of the truth. "I'm telling you that I lead an organization most people would describe that way. Yes," he said. "I wasn't planning to tell you like this, but you deserve honesty, especially after everything we've survived together." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, forcing her to sit down heavily in a nearby chair, her mind racing back through every strange detail of the past few days, every skill he possessed that now made a terrible kind of sense. The confidence with a blade. The careful, tactical way he had approached their survival. The guarded mark on his wrist that she now suspected was some kind of symbol tied to whatever organization he led. "This whole time," she said slowly, "I trusted a man I now find out runs a criminal empire." "You trusted a man who kept you alive," Dmitri said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Nothing about that has changed, Elena. I am still the same person who pulled you from that wreckage, who kept you fed and safe through 5 days in the wilderness. The label doesn't change what actually happened between us out there." "It changes everything," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, some traitorous part of her mind whispered that it was not entirely true, that the bond forged between them through shared danger felt far too real to simply dissolve because of a revelation about his profession. Dmitri crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I understand if you're afraid," he said. "I understand if you want nothing more to do with me once we part ways here. But I need you to understand something too. What we survived together, that was real. I don't extend the kind of trust I gave you to just anyone." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hint of deception, but finding only quiet sincerity beneath the careful control he usually wore like armor. "Why tell me the truth at all?" she asked. "You could have simply let me go, let me believe you were some ordinary businessman I would never see again." Something complicated passed across his features, a flash of vulnerability quickly masked by his usual composure. "Because I don't intend for this to be the last time we see each other," he said quietly. "And because whatever this is between us, it deserves to start with honesty, not lies." The weight of his words settled heavily in the small, quiet lobby, and Elena found herself unable to look away from him, caught between the rational fear any sensible person should feel and the undeniable pull of connection that had grown between them through days of shared hardship and vulnerability. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to process all of this. Time to figure out what any of it means." "That's fair," Dmitri said, straightening and stepping back slightly, giving her the space she needed. "Take whatever time you need. I won't push you into anything you're not ready for." But even as he said the words, Elena could see something resolute in his eyes, a quiet certainty that told her this conversation, however difficult, was far from over. Whatever world Dmitri came from, whatever dangers and complications came attached to a life spent leading an organization built on power and control, he had made it clear he had no intention of simply walking away from whatever had grown between them in the wilderness. The following morning, arrangements were finalized to transport both survivors back to the city, along with the difficult, sobering process of coordinating with authorities regarding the recovery of the crash site and the passengers who hadn't survived. Elena spent much of the drive in silence, staring out the window at the passing landscape, her mind replaying every moment of the past several days, in an attempt to reconcile the man who had saved her life with the dangerous truth of who he really was. Dmitri sat beside her, quiet and patient, offering space without withdrawing entirely, his presence a steady, watchful constant even as the distance between them, both physical and otherwise, seemed to shrink with every passing mile back toward the city. As they finally arrived at the outskirts of familiar streets, the ordinary sounds and sights of civilization feeling strangely foreign after days spent surviving in the wilderness, Elena realized with a growing sense of unease that returning to her normal life would not be as simple as she had hoped. The world she was re-entering now included Dmitri Kasarov, a man whose true identity carried weight and danger she was only beginning to understand. And somewhere, in circles she knew nothing about, word was already spreading that the powerful and notoriously private Dmitri Kasarov had survived a plane crash, and that he had not returned home alone. Elena's apartment felt strange when she finally returned to it, too quiet, too ordinary, as though the walls themselves couldn't quite believe she had come back from the mountains alive. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, before stepping inside, running her fingers over the familiar furniture, the stack of mail on the counter, the small details of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. She had barely unpacked when the first sign of change arrived. A car, sleek and dark, parked outside her building for hours at a time, its presence noted by her neighbors with mild curiosity. When she asked the building's doorman about it, he simply shrugged, mentioning that he had been told, quietly and firmly, that the vehicle belonged to someone ensuring her safety. Elena knew immediately who was responsible. She called Dmitri that evening, her frustration barely contained. "I didn't ask for protection," she said the moment he answered. "I know you didn't," he replied, his voice calm despite her clear irritation. "That doesn't mean you don't need it." "Need it from what exactly?" Elena pressed. "I thought this was over. We survived. We returned. We go back to our separate lives. That was the plan." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Elena wondered if he had hung up. "Word has spread that I survived the crash with a companion," he said finally. "In my world, that kind of information doesn't stay quiet. There are people who would see you as a way to reach me, to use you against me. I won't allow that to happen." Elena felt a chill settle over her, despite the warmth of her apartment. "You're saying I'm in danger because of you." "I'm saying I intend to make sure you're not," Dmitri corrected firmly. "There's a difference." The conversation left Elena unsettled, long after she ended the call, pacing her small living room as she tried to process the sudden, unwelcome complexity that had entered her carefully ordered life. She had spent years building a career through discipline and control, and now, through no choice of her own, she had become tangled in the dangerous orbit of a man whose world operated by entirely different rules. Over the following days, the reality of her new circumstances became increasingly difficult to ignore. The car remained parked outside her building. A man she didn't recognize, polite but unmistakably watchful, seemed to appear whenever she left for work, keeping a respectful distance, but never quite out of sight. When she confronted Dmitri about it during a tense phone call, his answer was simple and unwavering. "Until I'm certain you're safe, this doesn't stop," he said. "I understand if that upsets you, but I would rather you be angry with me, and safe, than free of my interference and vulnerable." Elena wanted to argue further, wanted to insist on her independence, her right to make her own choices about her own safety. But some quiet, uncomfortable part of her recognized the truth beneath his stubbornness, the same steady protectiveness that had kept her alive in the wilderness now extending into her ordinary life, whether she had asked for it or not. It was nearly 2 weeks after their return, when Dmitri finally requested to see her in person, arranging a private dinner at a quiet, upscale restaurant that Elena suspected, given the deferential way the staff treated him, was somehow connected to his world of influence and power. She arrived cautious and guarded, uncertain what to expect from the conversation ahead. Dmitri stood as she approached the table, pulling out her chair with an old-fashioned courtesy that felt strangely at odds with everything she now knew about him. "Thank you for coming," he said once they were both seated. "I wasn't sure I would," Elena admitted honestly. "Part of me still isn't sure this is a good idea." "And yet you're here," Dmitri observed, something gentle in his tone. "Curiosity mostly," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the lie in them. It wasn't simply curiosity that had brought her here. It was the same undeniable pull she had felt in the wilderness, the connection that had grown between them despite every reason it shouldn't have, that had drawn her back into his orbit, despite every warning bell ringing in her mind. They talked through dinner, the conversation ranging from lighter topics to more serious ones, Dmitri offering more details about his life than he had before, careful and measured, but honest in a way that surprised her. He spoke of the responsibilities he had inherited, the expectations placed upon him from a young age, the isolation that came with occupying a position of such significant power and danger. "Do you ever wish for a different life?" Elena asked at one point, studying him closely across the candlelit table. Dmitri considered the question seriously before answering. "I used to," he admitted, "when I was younger, before I fully understood what my position required of me. Now, I've made peace with who I am, with what my life demands, or at least, I had, until recently." "Until the crash," Elena said quietly, understanding the implication in his words. "Until you," Dmitri corrected, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I've spent years building walls around myself, Elena, keeping people at a careful distance because closeness in my world often becomes a liability. But somewhere in those 5 days we spent surviving together, something shifted. I find myself unwilling to simply walk away, even knowing how complicated, how dangerous, continuing this connection might be." The honesty in his words left Elena momentarily speechless, torn between the rational voice in her mind, warning her of the risks involved, and the quiet, undeniable pull of genuine connection that had grown between them through shared hardship and vulnerability. She had spent her entire adult life prioritizing careful, calculated decisions, and yet here she was, drawn toward a man whose world represented everything unpredictable and dangerous that she had always avoided. "I don't know how to navigate any of this," Elena admitted finally, her voice softer than she intended. "Everything about my life has been built on control, on predictability. You represent the exact opposite of that." "I'm not asking you to navigate it perfectly," Dmitri said. "I'm simply asking you not to close the door entirely. Let me prove that whatever exists between us is worth the complications it brings." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the rational arguments against the undeniable pull of connection, before finally nodding, slowly, cautiously. "One step at a time," she said. "No promises beyond that." "One step at a time," Dmitri agreed, something like relief and quiet triumph flickering behind his careful composure. Over the following weeks, their connection deepened gradually, careful and measured, despite the danger that continued to hover at the edges of Elena's awareness. Dmitri introduced her slowly to certain aspects of his world, always cautious, always protective, ensuring she understood the risks while shielding her from the most dangerous elements of his business whenever possible. She met a few members of his inner circle, most notably a sharp, quietly efficient woman named Grace, who served as his closest advisor, and a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who oversaw security with unwavering loyalty. Both regarded Elena with careful curiosity, clearly unaccustomed to their leader extending trust and affection toward anyone from outside their world. "He doesn't do this," Grace told her quietly one afternoon, when Dmitri had briefly stepped away during a visit to his estate. "Whatever you've done to earn his trust, it's not something I've seen before." "We survived something together," Elena said simply. "That changes people." Grace studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in her sharp gaze. "Perhaps," she said. "Just be careful, Elena. His world doesn't offer many second chances, and not everyone will be pleased to see him this attached to someone from outside it." The warning settled uneasily in Elena's mind, a reminder that whatever growing connection existed between herself and Dmitri, it existed within a world far more dangerous and complicated than anything she had encountered in her ordinary life before the crash. Still, despite every rational reason to retreat, to protect herself by maintaining distance, Elena found herself unable to deny the depth of what had grown between them. It was during a quiet evening at his estate, several weeks after their return from the wilderness, that Dmitri finally addressed the reality of their situation directly, his tone serious, as they sat together on a private terrace, overlooking manicured gardens bathed in soft evening light. "I need you to understand something," he said, taking her hand gently in his. "Being connected to me carries real risk. There are people who would use you against me without hesitation, who would see your presence in my life as an opportunity to cause harm. I won't pretend that danger doesn't exist." "I understand that," Elena said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than she intended. "I don't say this to frighten you away," Dmitri continued. "I say it because I intend to protect you regardless of the cost, and I need you to trust that protection, even when it feels overwhelming or unwanted." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words, understanding on some deep level that whatever connection had grown between them during those 5 desperate days in the wilderness had evolved into something far more serious, far more consequential than she had initially anticipated. She was no longer simply a survivor who had shared a harrowing experience with a stranger. She was becoming entangled in a world of danger and power that operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. And somewhere beyond the peaceful gardens of Dmitri's estate, forces were already gathering, rivals within his world taking careful note of his growing attachment to an outsider, calculating how best to exploit this newfound vulnerability in a man who had always, until now, kept himself carefully guarded against exactly this kind of weakness. The message arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered not by phone or courier, but through a careful, deliberate act designed to send a clear signal. Elena discovered it when she left her apartment for work, finding a single white lily placed precisely on the hood of her car, accompanied by a small card bearing no signature, only a short, chilling sentence written in elegant handwriting. "Everyone Dmitri cares for eventually becomes a target." Elena stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the card, her mind racing through every possible explanation before settling on the obvious, terrifying truth. Someone knew about her connection to Dmitri, and that someone wanted her to understand exactly what that connection might cost her. She called him immediately, her hands trembling as she described what she had found. Within 20 minutes, Dmitri arrived personally, his expression carefully controlled, but unable to fully mask the sharp concern in his eyes as he examined the card and the flower with grim focus. "This is a warning," he said quietly, his jaw tight. "Someone wants me to know they're watching, that they know about you." "Who would do this?" Elena asked, fear coiling tightly in her chest. Dmitri's expression darkened further. "There's a rival family, the Renshaws, who have been testing the boundaries of my territory for months now. This has their particular style of intimidation. Subtle, deliberate, designed to unsettle rather than cause immediate harm. And if subtle doesn't work? Elena asked, dreading the answer even as she asked the question. It won't come to that, Dmitri said firmly, though something in his tone suggested he was making a promise he intended to enforce through whatever means necessary. I'm doubling your security immediately. You won't go anywhere without protection from this point forward. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist on maintaining some semblance of normal independence in her life, but the fear coiled in her chest, combined with the grim determination in Dmitri's expression, convinced her that resistance would be both futile and unwise given the circumstances. Over the following days, Elena's life transformed dramatically under the weight of increased security. A quiet, watchful woman named Sophie became a constant, unobtrusive presence, accompanying her to work, to meetings, to the small errands that had once represented simple, unremarkable freedom. Elena found the constant supervision suffocating, though she understood, on some rational level, the necessity behind it. Dmitri, meanwhile, grew increasingly consumed by the escalating tension with the Renshaw family, spending long hours in tense meetings with his advisors, his usual calm composure fraying slightly at the edges as the threat against Elena weighed heavily upon him. She saw him less frequently during this period, though when they did meet, his attention toward her remained fierce and unwavering, his determination to protect her only intensifying alongside the growing danger. I don't want to be the reason you're distracted from everything else you need to manage, Elena said one evening, finding him tense and preoccupied at his estate, papers and reports spread across his desk, detailing the movements and activities of his rivals. Dmitri looked up at her, something raw and unguarded flickering across his features. You're not a distraction, Elena, he said. You're the reason any of this matters at all. Protecting my territory, my influence, none of it means anything if it costs me your safety. The intensity of his words left Elena momentarily breathless, the depth of his commitment both overwhelming and, despite the danger surrounding it, deeply moving. She had never experienced this kind of fierce, unwavering devotion from anyone before, and even amid the fear and uncertainty of their circumstances, she found herself unable to deny how deeply she had come to care for him in return. The situation escalated further nearly a week later, when Elena, despite Sophie's careful vigilance, found herself briefly separated from her security during a hurried stop at a busy shopping center, distracted momentarily by a phone call from a colleague. It was in that brief window of vulnerability that a man approached her directly, his manner polite, but unmistakably threatening beneath the surface. "Miss Voss," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "You've made quite an impression on someone who usually keeps his distance from outsiders." Elena's blood ran cold, her instincts screaming danger even as she forced herself to remain outwardly composed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully, scanning the crowded shopping center for any sign of Sophie. The man smiled, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Of course you don't," he said smoothly. "Just make sure Dmitri understands that we know exactly how much you matter to him now. That kind of knowledge tends to be useful." Before Elena could respond, Sophie appeared beside her, her expression sharp and alert, immediately positioning herself protectively between Elena and the stranger. The man simply smiled again, offering a slight, mocking bow before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Elena shaken, and Sophie visibly furious with herself for the momentary lapse in vigilance. The incident, when reported to Dmitri, sent him into a controlled but unmistakable fury, his usual calm composure cracking under the weight of genuine fear for Elena's safety. He arrived at her apartment within the hour, his expression grim, as he assessed her carefully, checking for any sign of harm, despite her repeated assurances that she was physically unharmed. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Elena hadn't heard before. "I should have anticipated they would test our security this directly. I won't make that mistake again." "Dmitri, I'm fine," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly with the lingering shock of the encounter. "Shaken, but fine." "You shouldn't have to be fine," Dmitri said, frustration and guilt warring visibly across his features. "You shouldn't have to experience any of this at all. This is exactly the danger I warned you about, and I still failed to prevent it." "You didn't fail," Elena said firmly, reaching out to take his hand, grounding him with her touch. We're dealing with something neither of us fully controls, but we're dealing with it together. Dmitri looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective settling behind his dark eyes. Together, he repeated quietly, as though testing the weight of the word. I like the sound of that more than I probably should, given everything currently working against us. Despite the danger, despite the mounting tension surrounding their relationship, Elena found a strange, unexpected comfort in his presence, in the unwavering determination he showed toward keeping her safe, regardless of personal cost. The fear that should have driven her away, instead seemed to deepen her resolve to stand beside him through whatever challenges lay ahead. Over the following days, Dmitri intensified his efforts against the Renshaw threat, working carefully alongside Grace and Marcus to identify weaknesses in his rivals' operations, to send a clear, unmistakable message that any further attempts to threaten Elena would carry severe consequences. Elena, meanwhile, found herself drawn deeper into his world, attending careful, guarded meetings where she observed firsthand the intricate, dangerous balance of power that defined his daily existence. You handle all of this with such precision, she observed one evening, watching him coordinate a complex negotiation with quiet, commanding authority. It's the only way to survive in this world, Dmitri said, though something in his tone suggested a weariness he rarely allowed himself to express. Precision, control, careful calculation. Any weakness becomes an opportunity for someone else to exploit. And yet you let me in, Elena said quietly. Despite the risk, despite everything it could cost you. Dmitri turned to face her fully, his expression softening slightly, despite the tension of recent events. Some risks are worth taking, he said simply. You're one of them. The quiet sincerity in his words settled deeply within Elena's chest, reinforcing the connection that had grown steadily stronger between them since that first terrifying night in the wilderness. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever challenges their unlikely relationship would continue to face, she found herself increasingly certain that she wanted to face them alongside him, rather than retreating into the safety of her old, ordinary life. But even as their bond deepened, the threat from the Renshaw family continued to loom, patient and calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike more directly at the vulnerability Dmitri had so carefully tried to protect. And soon, that moment would arrive, forcing both Elena and Dmitri to confront the true, dangerous cost of the connection they had built together in the aftermath of tragedy. It happened on a rainy afternoon, nearly a month after the flower and card had first appeared on Elena's car. She had insisted, against Dmitri's better judgment, on attending a routine meeting at her law firm, unwilling to let fear completely dismantle the career she had spent years building. Sophie accompanied her as always, positioned discreetly nearby throughout the meeting. It was during the short walk back to the car afterward that everything unraveled. A van pulled alongside them with practiced efficiency, and before Sophie could react, two men emerged, moving with the same unsettling calm Elena remembered from the stranger at the shopping center. Sophie fought to protect her, but was quickly overwhelmed, and Elena found herself pulled into the van despite her desperate attempts to resist, the vehicle speeding away before anyone on the busy street fully registered what had happened. She was taken to an isolated location outside the city, a quiet, unremarkable building that gave no indication of the danger it held within. The men who had taken her were professional, controlled, offering no explanation beyond assurances that she would not be harmed as long as she cooperated and remained calm. You're simply insurance, one of them told her coldly, as she sat, wrists bound, in a sparse, dimly lit room. A message to remind Dmitri Kasarov that reaching into places he shouldn't has consequences. Elena forced herself to remain outwardly calm despite the fear coursing through her, drawing on every ounce of composure she had honed through years of high-pressure negotiations. She knew, with absolute certainty, that Dmitri would come for her. The only question was how quickly, and at what cost. Back in the city, Dmitri received the news of Elena's disappearance with a fury more controlled and more dangerous than anything he had displayed before. Grace and Marcus moved swiftly, mobilizing every resource available to trace the van, to identify the location where Elena had been taken, while Dmitri himself worked with cold, focused precision, setting aside every ounce of personal fear in favor of methodical, decisive action. "We have a location," Marcus reported within a few tense hours, having tracked communications linked to known Renshaw properties. "An old warehouse outside the city. It fits the pattern of their previous operations." "Then that's where we go," Dmitri said, his voice devoid of the emotional volatility one might expect, replaced instead by a controlled, purposeful determination that unsettled even those closest to him. The operation to recover Elena was swift and carefully coordinated, Dmitri personally leading a small, highly capable team to the warehouse location as darkness fell over the city. Grace remained in constant communication, monitoring the situation with careful precision, while Marcus coordinated security around the perimeter, ensuring no unexpected complications arose during the delicate operation. Inside the warehouse, Elena remained composed despite the mounting anxiety of her captivity, focusing her mind on small, deliberate observations, noting details about her surroundings, the number of guards, the layout of the building, anything that might prove useful should an opportunity for escape or rescue present itself. When Dmitri's team finally arrived, their approach was swift and efficient, neutralizing the threat with the same careful precision that characterized everything Dmitri did. Elena heard the sudden commotion outside her room, brief and controlled, followed by a tense silence before the door finally opened, revealing Dmitri himself, his expression a complicated mixture of fierce relief and barely contained fury. "Elena," he said, crossing the room in quick strides, kneeling to carefully untie the restraints binding her wrists. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, though tears of relief slipped freely down her cheeks as he helped her to her feet. "I will always come for you," Dmitri said fiercely, pulling her into a careful, protective embrace, his usual composure momentarily abandoned in favor of raw, unguarded emotion. "Always, Elena, no matter what it costs." The relief of finally being safe, combined with the overwhelming intensity of his devotion, left Elena momentarily speechless, clinging to him as the adrenaline of her ordeal finally began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the profound comfort of his presence. They returned to his estate that same night, and in the days that followed, Dmitri moved decisively to ensure the Renshaw family understood, unmistakably, the severe consequences of their actions. Elena, though she remained largely shielded from the specific details of how the situation was ultimately resolved, understood from Grace's careful, reassuring updates that the threat had been thoroughly and permanently addressed, leaving no doubt within his world that any future attempt to use Elena against him would carry consequences too severe to risk. In the quiet weeks that followed, as the immediate danger finally began to recede, Elena found herself reflecting deeply on everything that had unfolded since that terrifying night the plane had gone down in the mountains. She had entered that wilderness as an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, and emerged from it entangled in a world of danger and power she never could have anticipated, bound to a man whose devotion, once fully revealed, proved as fierce and unwavering as anything she had ever witnessed. It was on a quiet evening, several weeks after her rescue, that Dmitri finally addressed the future directly, finding her on the same private terrace where he had first spoken honestly about the risks of their connection. "I owe you an honest choice," he said, sitting beside her, his expression serious despite the gentle warmth in his eyes. "Everything that's happened, the danger, the fear, the complications my world brings into your life, none of it is fair to ask you to accept, simply because of what grew between us in that wilderness." "You're offering me a way out," Elena said quietly, understanding the weight behind his words. "I'm offering you the truth," Dmitri corrected gently. "You deserve to choose this fully, with complete understanding of what it means, rather than simply being swept along by circumstances beyond your control. If you walk away now, I will ensure your safety and respect your decision completely, whatever it costs me personally." Elena studied him for a long moment, considering the enormity of the choice before her. She thought about the ordinary, predictable life she had lived before the crash, the careful, controlled existence built around professional achievement and personal safety. She thought too about everything she had discovered since then, about the fierce, unwavering devotion Dmitri had shown her, about the strange, unexpected sense of belonging she had found within his world despite its dangers. "I've had plenty of time to think about walking away," she said finally, reaching out to take his hand. "Every single time, I keep arriving at the same conclusion. Whatever risks come with staying, they matter less to me than the thought of losing what we've built together." Dimitri's expression shifted, relief and profound emotion breaking through his usual careful composure. "You understand what you're choosing," he said, though it was more statement than question. "I understand completely," Elena confirmed. "I'm choosing you, Dmitri. Not because circumstances forced me into this, but because I genuinely want this life, complicated and dangerous as it might be, as long as I'm building it alongside you." Dmitri pulled her close then, his relief and devotion evident in every careful, protective line of his embrace. "I promise you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, "I will spend every day ensuring you never regret this choice." As the sun set slowly over the gardens surrounding his estate, casting warm golden light across the terrace where they sat together, Elena felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, different from anything she had known in her previous, ordinary life, but no less genuine or complete. The plane crash that had once seemed like the worst tragedy of her life had, in the strangest possible way, led her exactly to where she now realized she belonged. She was no longer simply a survivor of that terrifying night in the mountains. She had become something far more significant, a woman who had faced genuine danger and emerged not diminished, but strengthened, bound by choice rather than circumstance, to a man whose fierce devotion matched her own growing love for him in equal measure. Together, they faced the uncertain future ahead, no longer strangers thrown together by tragedy, but partners who had chosen each other fully, ready to navigate whatever challenges their unlikely, extraordinary love story would continue to bring.